for us, and that overall you would be glorified as we seek to understand you and your word. For it's in your Son's name. Amen. Okay. So we are taking a detour. We're going to be spending the next 4 weeks in the book of Daniel. I think this is important, especially before we get to Revelation chapter 13. We could have did this way back when in chapters, actually chapter like 4-ish or 5-ish there. But I decided we were going to wait because chapter 13 has a lot to do with the activity of the one known as the conqueror and the beast. And so we will be looking at some of the historical kind of markers throughout the book of Daniel. Let's go ahead and, oh, maybe I should do this. Yeah, I always forget. Does this work at all? It's plugged in. I have a green button on my. Is that a challenge?
I'm not sure.
Technical difficulties.
Technically, there's a difficulty. Take the batteries.
Well, I'll just go ahead and do this manually till when he gets back. So like I said, before we go into Revelation chapter 13, we will review chapters 11 and 12 concerning the book of Daniel. So let's go ahead and turn there if you haven't already, and then we will kind of walk through this text here. Some general observations concerning just the book of Daniel overall. Daniel was written during the time of captivity and the Babylonian captivity. So when Israel was in the nation of Babylon, this is where this particular book was penned. That's important because, again, this was after the destruction of the temple. The first temple here was razed. Men, women, and children were slaughtered, and the remaining of the Israelites were taken into captivity in Babylon. Okay. Daniel's concerns the future of the history of Gentile empires. This is a very curious time. You don't have to do that.
I love you, brother.
Oh, okay.
Try that now.
Okay. Thank you.
Doesn't work after that. I don't know.
Well, we'll see what happens. Nope. It's dead. That's okay. We can still continue. Daniel concerns the future history of the Gentile empires. It's very fascinating that Daniel and the rest of the Israelites being held captive from their native homeland, within that particular captivity, some of the information within Daniel concerns the Gentile nations, considering the empires that were Gentile in history. So not only are they not in a land all their own, they have been taken out of the land that was given to them to reside to be strangers in a strange land, literally. But Daniel will be given images and information concerning Gentile nations and empires. You know, it's kind of fascinating. When I was in school, I never really learned about the history of Israel. I learned about the history of all these other empires that we talked about, but never Israel. In this particular book of Daniel, it has a focus of Israel and the nations in relation to these empires. So Israel figures prominently in this particular book, and it concerns the future of Israel as a nation, and ultimately their deliverance as a people from the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So, in one sense, it's very how could you say, it's very pessimistic in its scope, because Israel has been taken out of the land. They have, it's almost like they have no land. Their people have been scattered, and they have been judged as a result of their idolatry. But there's also hope and promise that one day God will bring them back together after a tumultuous period and will rule over them and inaugurate everlasting righteousness. And this, of course, the installation of the Messiah's kingdom is also referenced in Daniel as well. Let's look at some of the observance, just a quick observance of chapter 10. In verses 1 to 6, we see a messenger comes to Daniel after he was essentially mourning and fasting. We read this in chapter 10, verses 1 to 6. In the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a message was revealed to Daniel, who was named Belshazzar, and the message was true and one of great conflict. But he understood the message and had understanding of the vision. It says, in those days, I, Daniel, had been mourning for 3 entire weeks. I did not eat any tasty food, nor did meat or wine enter my mouth, nor did I use any ointment until all the entire 3 weeks were completed. This is off the heels, really, of Daniel chapter 9 concerning the 70 bundles, or the 77s, where God essentially, through an angelic host, lays out the entire history of Israel. Okay? In the chapters to come, this messenger that comes to Daniel is going to do this again. God's going to reveal his plan to Israel concerning the Israelite people again, but he's going to bring more great detail. In verses 7 to 9 of the book of Daniel, of chapter 10, we see the response of Daniel. After he was mourning and fasting, this messenger comes to him and gives him great detail about, and Daniel writes great detail about what this messenger looks like. Verse 5, I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, there was a certain man dressed in linen, whose waist was girded with a pure gold of Uphaz. His body was also like beryl. His face had the appearance of lightning. His eyes were like flaming torches. This should sound familiar to us because we've read these characteristics and qualities before. Usually when a person shows up like this, the person becomes terrified, which we read forward there. That's what happens to Daniel and the people that are with him. But this is usually to underscore that the message that this messenger is going to give is very important, because Daniel gives some of the details of this messenger. Then we see again the response to the sound and the sight of this otherworldly being. Verse 7, now I, Daniel, alone saw the vision, while the men who were with me did not see the vision. Nevertheless, a great dread fell on them, and they ran away to hide themselves. So even though they couldn't see, they fled. So I was left alone and saw this great vision. I had no strength left in me, for my natural color turned to a deathly pallor, and I retained no strength. But I heard the sound of his words, and as soon as I heard the sound of his words, I fell into a deep sleep on my face. In other words, he fainted. He was out with my face to the ground, scared to death, right? So then we see the delivering of this message to Daniel in verses 10 to 21, where this messenger has been kind of hindered. And so Michael, the archangel, has to show up again to help this messenger. And this messenger, again, will basically gives him the details of, I'm going to tell you some more information regarding essentially your people. This brings us on to the heels of Daniel chapter 11. I have to tell you, if the people who wrote The Chosen ever want to do an epic, okay, they could look no further than Daniel, okay, because it has everything in here. It has intrigue, It has suspense. There is double crossing and backstabbing like you wouldn't believe in these chapters. There is love, romance. There are destructions of kingdoms and kings, assassinations. All of that stuff is written within these last chapters of Daniel. And within the center of all of this conflict and hostility, we find that Israel is at the center of all of this. Let's start in Daniel chapter 11, verses 1 and 2. In the first year of Darius the Mede, I rose to be of assistance and protection for him. And now I will tell you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia. Then a fourth will gain far more riches than all of them. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, he will stir up an entire empire against the realm of Greece. The messenger begins to tell Daniel some of the historical markers that are going to take place throughout history while he and his people are within captivity. Here we go. In the first year of Darius the Mede, I rose to be of assistance and protection for him, and now I'll tell you the truth. This messenger says, this is Darius the Mede from the time of Daniel. Darius is spoken about in various chapters of Daniel, but especially in chapter 6, verses 25 to 26. A couple of chapters over, we read about Darius. This is after Darius. This is after Daniel is thrown into the lion's den. Again, Darius and Daniel, Darius trusted Daniel, but threw him in because of the ordinance that he wrote. Verse 25, then Darius, the king, wrote to all peoples and nations and language of every language who were living in the land. May your peace abound. I issue a decree that in all my royal dominion, people must tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. All right. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed. His dominion has no end. This is interesting because Darius is not a Jew. He's not an Israelite. He's a Gentile. And yet he understands that this God that Daniel worships is the living God, the God who endures forever. Very interesting. He rescues and delivers. He performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. For he has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions, as an example to Darius of the power and the reputation of God. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus, the Persian. So we see that Darius the Mede is mentioned in Daniel, and this angelic messenger assisted and strengthened Darius, probably more likely to do the Darius's recognition of the God of Israel. It's very clear here, right? Daniel was thrown in the den of lions. He was saved and protected, and Darius recognizes that God is the living God. Behold, 3 more kings are going to arise in Persia. That is verse 2 of chapter 11. Persia is modern-day Iran. Okay, this is mentioned in verse 2. Okay. And then we also have in verses 8, Egypt in chapter 11, which is mentioned. So out of Persia, 3 more kings are going to arise, again in verse 2. The first kings, or the first ruler that was to come out of Iran or Persia, was Cambyses. Okay, Cambyses lived from 529 to 522. As a matter of fact, what's fascinating about this is this Cambyses was born of Cyrus. Cyrus, again, being mentioned also in Daniel. Okay. Cassandane was his wife, so Cambyses was born of Cyrus and her. So when Cyrus conquered Babylon, Cambyses was second to the throne, obviously, as sons go. We have some nepotism going on here. Once he dies, Cambyses ascends the throne. He began his rule in 530 BC after his father had passed away. So Cambyses was set to rule after his father died. Cambyses, in 525 BC, after his rule, he essentially was a ruler. There wasn't really a lot going on under his rule. Not really many wars or anything. There was a famine that happened in 528 BC, and a lot of people that took that as Cambyses wasn't worthy enough to rule because of this famine. However, Cambyses decided he was going to invade Egypt because there was a promise made by the Pharaoh of Egypt to give the daughter to Cambyses for marriage. Pharaoh did not make good on that promise, and so Cambyses decided he was going to invade Egypt. And by 525, he essentially ruled all of Egypt. At this point in history, this was at the height of Cambyses' rule. And Cambyses, much like his father, became a great king of Persia and essentially ruled over this region. So this is one king that's mentioned in chapter 11, verse 2. The second king is Artaxerxes from 522 to 521 BC. Artaxerxes is mentioned in the book of Ezra, chapter 4, verse 7. As they returned to build the temple and begin preparations for doing that, and the activity of the temple, we find during the time of King Artaxerxes of Persia, Bishlam, Meredith, Tabeel, and the rest of his colleagues wrote to Artaxerxes in a letter written in Aramaic. Okay? This is concerning, again, the activity of the building of the temple. The third ruler, again, was known as Darius I. Darius I, again, was important. We find him in Ezra chapter 4, verse 24, concerning the importance in the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the temple and all of that stuff. In Ezra chapter 4, verses 23 to 24, we read, as soon as the text of King Artaxerxes' letter was read to Rehum, Shemashai the scribe, and their colleagues, they immediately went to the Jews of Jerusalem and forcibly stopped them. Now the construction of God's house in Jerusalem had stopped and remained standstill until the second year of King Darius of Persia. So we have King Artaxerxes essentially stopping the temple from being built, and then King Darius coming and issuing an edict to continue building the temple and all of its effects. So these three, that is Cambyses, Artaxerxes, and Darius, were all great kings of Persia with much power and influence. But then we find a fourth will gain far more riches than all of them. This is found in chapter 11, verses 2 and following. As soon as he becomes strong through his riches, again, Daniel chapter 11, verse 2. So the fourth king who exceeds all of these individuals is Ahasuerus. Okay? We find him in the book of Esther. He plays very prominently in history because the book of Esther talks about the preservation of Israel. Esther chapter 1, verses 1 to 9 says this: these events took place during the days of Ahasuerus, who ruled 127 provinces from India to Cush. It's a lot. In those days, King Ahasuerus reigned from his royal throne in the fortress at Susa. He held a feast in the 3rd year of his reign for all the officials and staff, the army of Persia and Media, the nobles, and the officials from the provinces. He displayed the glorious wealth of his kingdom and the magnificent splendor of his greatness for a total of 180 days. That's a long time. At the end of his time, the king held a week-long banquet in the garden courtyard of the royal palace for all the people, from the greatest to the least. I mean, this guy was so wealthy. I mean, 7 days for everyone. Just say, hey, take some time off of work. Let's party, right? Who were present in the fortress of Susa. White and violet linen hangings were fashioned with fine white and purple linen cords to silver rods on marble columns. Gold and silver couches were arranged on mosaic pavement of gold feldspar, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Beverages were served in an array of gold goblets. This is for everybody, each with a different design. Royal wine flowed freely according to the king's bounty, and no restraint was placed on the drinking. The king had ordered every wine steward in his household to serve as much as each person wanted. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women of King Ahasuerus' palace. So this gentleman had riches far beyond anyone at that particular time. Again, his importance involves the preservation of Israel as a people. If you read the book of Esther, you find that basically the extermination of Israel was being threatened, and Ahasuerus was important. Esther played a role in that, in meeting Ahasuerus, becoming essentially one of his courtesans, and convinced Ahasuerus essentially to preserve her people. And as a result, they were able to defend themselves from the army that was essentially by Mordecai seeking to destroy them. And mighty king will arise. This is verse 3. And a mighty king will arise and rule with great authority and do as he pleases. Now, we've already talked about four rulers that have come up, but who is this mighty king, this great king that will arise and basically do as he wants? This ruler or this king is Alexander the Great. His importance involves, again, the preservation of Israel as a people. We find his particular rule prophesied in Daniel chapter 8, verses 5 and following. As I was observing, a male goat appeared coming from the west across the surface of the entire earth without touching the ground. The goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. Again, Daniel's seeing a vision here. And he came to the two-horned ram, which I had seen standing behind the canal, and rushed at him with savage fury. A goat coming towards a ram. I saw him approaching the ram and, infuriated with him, and struck the ram, shattering his two horns. And the ram was not strong enough to stand against him. The goat threw him to the ground and trampled him, and there was no one to rescue the ram from his power. The male goat became very great, but when he became powerful, the large horn was shattered. 4 conspicuous horns came up in its place toward the 4 winds of heaven. If you jump down to verse 21, it says the shaggy goat is given the who this goat is, represents the king of Greece. And the large horn between his eyes represents the first king. So this individual here is Alexander the Great, was a great military leader, expanded essentially the Grecian Empire. Verse 4, but as soon as he is arisen, his kingdom will be broken up and parceled out toward the 4 points of the compass, though not to his own descendants, nor according to his authority which he wielded, because his sovereignty will be removed and given to others besides them. So no sooner than Alexander the great military strategist and ruler of this particular time with a great widespread empire, is broken up into 4 parcels or 4 sections and is given to 4 of his generals. Okay, now he had more generals than that. We'll talk about this in a little bit, but he breaks them up with the four generals. One general goes by in the name of Cassander. He is responsible or in charge of Macedonia, Greece. All right. Well, part of that Macedonian area is given to him. The second land parceled is I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. We'll call him L. How about that? His rule is over Asia Minor. Okay. So if I ever had a kid, I would name them this. Asia Minor. Parcel land 3 is Cyrus in Asia provinces of Syria. So the north. Okay. And then the last parcel land is given to Ptolemy, which is Egypt and the southern part of Israel. So we have Cassander, which is in Macedonia, the Grecian part. We have El, who is ruling or governing over Asia Minor. Cyrus, who's in provinces of Syria to the north, and Ptolemy, who is Egypt to the south. From this point forward, in verses 5 to 20 of Daniel chapter 11, that is again given to Daniel by the divine messenger, has to do with the lineage of Cyrus, which is the king of the north, and Ptolemy. Okay? So Cassander and El are no longer mentioned here. They're just mentioned as a historical marker that Alexander the Great had to divide his land with the 4 generals. But the king of the north and the king of the south are now prominent throughout the rest of the chapter. And these titles, kings of the north, king of the north, and king of the south, will be used frequently to describe the different rulers of the north and the south, more often in line of nepotism. Okay, so Cyrus and Ptolemy. Okay, the king of the south will grow strong, along with one of his princes, who will gain ascendancy over him and rule. This is Daniel chapter 11, verse 5. His domain will be great, a realm indeed. Okay. So the king of the south, again, Ptolemy is his name. So Ter 1, 323 to 285 BC. He was Alexander the Great's most influential generals. Okay. Now, what's interesting is he was so great, he even proclaimed himself as the king of Egypt. Okay. Because Alexander divided this land to him and parceled it out. So he referred to himself. I'm the king of Egypt now, right? His dynasty ruled Egypt until 30 BC. So that's a long time, right? The prince of the king of the south, again, is Cyrus, 321 to 281 BC. He gained authority to rule in Babylon in 321. Okay. And so you have another general that's entered in by the name of Antigonus, who was one of Alexander's generals. So like I said, he had more than 4. He had many of them. And Antigonus attacked Babylon. Well, when you attack Babylon, you attack Seleucus, right? That's because he's the prince of the king of the south. Well, Seleucus I sought assistance from Ptolemy. Well, even though he ruled the north, he was the prince of the king of the south. So he went to Ptolemy to regain control of Babylon against Antigonus. And Seleucus I essentially submitted to Ptolemy and his desires to overtake Antigonus. So they entered into an agreement to basically overtake him. Seleucus I eventually ruled all of Babylon, Media, and Syria. After this, he assumed the title King of the North. Okay? After he ruled Babylon, Media, and eventually Syria. Okay? So Seleucus I dynasty endured until 64 BC. Now, I'm going to take a moment to catch my breath right quick, because there's a lot going on here. So in the south, that is in Egypt, Ptolemy died, okay? And again, we have nepotism going on. So, of course, the son is destined to rule in his place. And leaving son Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, to take his place as the king of the south. In 281 BC, Seleucus was assassinated, and his son Antiochus I took his place, but he died a little bit afterwards. Okay, in 262 BC, so his rule wasn't very long, and his son, because again nepotism, took his place and assumed power. Okay, so now we have, just to go back, Ptolemy II and Antiochus II. Are you with me so far? Probably not. Okay, that's all right. After some years, they will form an alliance. The daughter of the king of the south will come to the king of the north and reach an agreement, but she will not keep her position of power, nor will he remain with his power, but she will be given up along with those who brought her in and fathered her, as well as he who supported her in those times. This is Daniel chapter 11, verse 6. Let's take a look at some of the details here and how this messenger has told history to Daniel and how it has been completed. Ptolemy II and Antiochus II, king of the south and king of the north, Egypt and Syria are hostile towards one another. They don't really like each other very much. But for the sake of peace and not destroying one another, they made an alliance with the marriage of Ptolemy's daughter, whose name is Bernice, okay, to Antiochus II, the king of the north. At the same time, he divorced his wife. That's a touch, right? Laodice, for his arrangement. Now, if you recognize the name, the term Laodicea comes from Antiochus II. He named his wife. He named Laodicea after his wife. Okay. Antioch was also named after Antiochus II. But he divorced his wife for this arrangement. Probably not a smart move. When Ptolemy II died, Antiochus II took back his first wife, okay, whom he divorced to marry Bernice. What a household, huh? So Laos, of course, Laodicea had some feelings about that. Okay, so she had Bernice and Bernice's son murdered. Okay, and then she also poisoned her husband. It's probably a good idea. This is just an aside here. If you have one wife, you probably should keep her. You know, don't divorce her. You know, it's probably not a good idea. Laos, because Bernice and Bernice's son died, there is no one to ascend the throne here. And of course, her husband is dead, right? So she ruled in her husband's place for a time being. Okay? That is the completion of verse 6 of chapter 11. Okay? So if you want a practical application, don't divorce your wife if you're married, you know, and then take her back, because then hemlock is the word. Verse 7. But one of the descendants of her line will arise in his place, and he will come against their army and enter the fortress of the king of the north and deal with him and prevail. So Bernice's brother, Ptolemy III, succeeded his father, Ptolemy II. Keeping track so far? So now Ptolemy III is now the king of the south. Ptolemy III eagerly desired to avenge Bernice's death. Okay, because, you know, he feels some way about that. So Ptolemy III attacks Seleucus II at Antioch in Syria and murders Laodicea. After that, pretty much Ptolemy III just basically ended up conquering all the lands he touched, essentially, and much of the neighboring territory surrounding that. And he remained in his power for the rest of his reign. So now Ptolemy III, the king of the south, owns much of this. Within the center of all of this conflict is Israel. Okay? It's interesting. Verse 8, he will also take into captivity to Egypt their gods with their cast metal and images and precious vessels of silver and gold, and he on his part will refrain from attacking the king of the north for some years. Continuing this in verse 8, again, Ptolemy conquered much of the neighboring territory and remained in power the rest of his reign. Ptolemy returned to Egypt from Antioch, essentially with the spoil and treasure from Syria. When he invaded Syria, he took a lot of the treasure. That's what you do. And then he returned to Egypt with all of it. After that particular conflict, Ptolemy III signed a treaties with Seleucus II. Probably more so because Seleucus was just, you know, he was pretty much conquered at that point, and had established a peace between the two nations. Now, of course, Seleucus wouldn't be happy about that because he just got conquered. So, thus, verse 9. Then the latter will enter the realm of the kingdom of the south, but will return to his own land. Essentially, Seleucus II invaded Egypt later on and returned back to his land unsuccessful. So he was not successful in his conquest to take the king of the south. And he essentially returned back to his land. So where are we in this timeline? Well, I have a helpful chart here, which was beneficial. Google does wonders for us. This is where we are here. The red squares here. So we talked about Seleucus and Ptolemy. We've talked about Antiochus I and Ptolemy II, Antiochus II, and now we are here in Seleucus II and Ptolemy II, or Ptolemy III. Excuse me. Again, within this particular timeline, we have Israel at the center of the heart of all of these events. It will become clear as we go forward, as we read forward in chapter 11 of Daniel. Let us close the curtain on Act 1. Let's go ahead and pray, and then we will close out this lesson here. Lord, there is so much history here, so much, Lord, that we can glean from this text to remember and underscore that the scriptures are historical in nature. I know that sometimes I forget that, and it's good to be reminded, Lord, that this is also a history book as well as a theological book. I thank you, Lord, for these details and scholars and historians and people who saw your word as valuable, took great pains to document all of these events historically. I thank you, Lord, for Israel and how you have been faithful to them to this whole time, giving them the history of the nation and how you will preserve, keep, and ultimately deliver them. Thank you, Lord, so much for these promises that you've given to them. And may we continue to be encouraged as we read forward of how all these things will take place and how ultimately it will bring about the everlasting kingdom. We love you so much, Lord, for it's in your Son's name. Amen.